Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Alex, story we ride the stories of the West, campfire truths, trail dust, memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. Ash Ridge, Colorado. The sky came up thin and colorless, a sheet of old glass pressed over the front range. Elias Holt rode the north pasture at a walk, breath steaming from the horse and from him, both white and brief in the brittle air. The lantern hooked to his saddle ring swung with each step a warm coin that refused to touch the snow. The drifted fence line cut a black seam through the meadow. Wire hummed in the wind, a low singing that came and went. Frost bearded the posts. His coat had a crust where the storm had blown sideways during the night, tiny needles lodged in the wool. He kept his collar up and his eyes down, counting posts, checking staples, habit, doing the thinking his mouth had not done in weeks. At post 30, he saw the thing and pulled up. The wire had caught a color, a flash that did not belong to winter. A glass jar dangled by a loop of red twine, the kind saved in a kitchen drawer, bright where it rubbed against barbs. The jar spun slow its round side, taking the gray light and giving it back. No label now, only a pale shadow where fruit had once smiled. A cork capped the throat. The twine knot was careful. A small hands worked tight in a way that had been learned, not guessed. Elias slid down, snow squeaking under his boots. The horse mouthed at the bit, then settled, ears turning to the wire's song. The metal had a skin of ice. He felt it through the glove, a thin bite even through leather. He steadied the jar with one hand and traced the knot with his thumb. 2 turns, a tuck through snug. He said it aloud without meaning to a voice rough with disuse. "Who taught you to tie like this?" He turned the jar and saw paper inside folded to a square and then folded again to fit the curve. Sugar lived in the glass, some old memory of jam holding in a sweetness that did not belong to this morning. The cork came away with a soft sound, and his breath made a little cloud over the mouth. He shook the jar and caught the paper on his fingertips, careful not to tear it. The wind pressed at his back and quieted as if the meadow had leaned in. Graphite on cheap paper, a school slate kind of gray. Writing that started tall and then fell, little letters trying to be brave. He read it once and his hands did not move. "If you find this, please be our daddy for Christmas. June and Lark." For a long moment he stood with the paper half open, his glove creasing a corner he did not want to crease. Snow ticked on the jar like fingernails. His breath went out and came back against the scarf. He held the words near enough to feel their weight and far enough not to drown in them. From the brush beyond the fence came a rustle, thin as a mouse, quick as a thought. Elias turned his head. A willow switch quivered and stilled. The lantern knocked lightly against the saddle ring, a single clink in the cold. He would tell himself later it was a bird. The wire sang again, a different pitch, 4 short notes, and then the wind swallowed them. He folded the paper along the lines it had already chosen. His gloves made clumsy work of it, so he peeled one off and used the bare hand, the skin gone red at once. He did not hurry. The pencil had pressed hard where the names were a child's certainty, that names were the part that mattered. He pressed the crease with the pad of his thumb and looked to the trees. The brush offered only its own silence back. Elias put the paper inside his coat, into the little pocket stitched high where heat stayed. The habit had nothing to do with letters and everything to do with the way a body keeps fire. The jar he restoppered and left to swing a small lamp without flame. The red twine had a frayed end, and a single strand had broken free. It caught on a barb and held like a hair. He walked the length of 3 posts and came back. The fence did not need him yet, but he set a staple anyway, a hammer tap that felt good in the wrist. He brushed rime from a brace and the frost stuck, then let go in a soft powder. When he straightened, he looked toward the rise where the timber started. There were tracks near a cedar small, 2 sets, then a mess where drift had blown across. He let his eyes pass over them without naming them anything. He took the bridle in hand and stood with the horse a moment, cheek against cold leather breath, warming the ring where the lantern hung. The sound of his own breathing felt louder than the field. He said nothing to the animal. He had not said much to any living thing for a long time. Words had a way of waking up rooms in his chest that he had boarded shut. The jar knocked once against the wire. He looked at it again. It turned and showed him the cork, then the empty side where label glue had ghosted a fruit, then the red loop, then the glass, then the field turned upside down inside it. He put the glove back on and touched the twine. The knot held. He could have cut it and taken the jar. He did not. A thing left in a place often meant there was a plan for it, a path he did not own. The wind rose. The lantern flame leaned and then found center. Far off, a magpie shouted from a cottonwood, black on white, the only loud voice in the day. The horse shifted and stamped. Elias pulled the stirrup with his glove and set a boot, then swung up. The saddle leather talked in little creaks. He gathered the reins and did not look toward the brush again. He had learned to let certain questions live where they started. He turned toward the ranch, toward the low line of buildings that sat backed into the hillside, as if trying to get out of the weather. The sky had brightened by a shade. Not blue, not yet, just less gray. Snow along the wire flashed when the lantern swung. He rode clear of the fence and made a slow trail through untouched powder, the horse's lungs working under him, the rhythm steady and clean. Between posts, he took his hand from the reins and touched the coat where the paper lay. It was not a gesture meant for anyone to see. It was a way of telling his hand that something new had weight. He pictured the pencil pressing in the names carved a little deeper than the rest. June, Lark, girls by the curl of the letters, by the way the word daddy had been shaped like a small bowl trying to hold more than it could. The meadow fell behind, and the first of the pines took the wind in their tops. Snow fell from a heavy branch and thumped to earth. The horse jumped, settled again, ears flicking back for permission. Elias laid 2 fingers on the neck and felt heat under hair and ice. He breathed once, a full breath. It scraped going in and came out warm. At the last rise, he looked back. The jar was a dot on the wire, a single seed against a long, dark string. The red loop found the light and winked. He lost it in the emptiness and faced the slope. The lantern ran a line of gold along the horse's shoulder and then let it go. He put the animal into a trot and then eased it down. There was no hurry, not here. By the time the first rooftop of Blue Hollow showed itself, smoke threaded from the stovepipe in a straight line. The cold held the line up like a wire. Elias felt the paper against his chest with each step. It rode with him an extra beat inside the winter. He did not speak the names. He kept them where his breath was tucked close, warm enough to keep from breaking. Ash Ridge never looked larger than on mornings when the clouds hung low and the smoke from each stovepipe rose straight up, caught and held by the cold. Elias put the horse away long enough to rub a cloth over the saddle and warm his hands over the cook stove. He drank 1 cup of coffee gone thin, set the cup down without sound, and took the road into town. The track ran hard under the snow, where wagon wheels had flattened it. At the edge of town, the lanterns in front of the hotel were still lit yellow eyes in the gray. A boy with a broom pushed slush off the porch of the eating house in careful lines. The blacksmith yard stood quiet, tools hung neat and dark with frost. The bell at the white church gave 4 slow notes and stopped. Each note seemed to land in the air and sit there. Elias tied off at the rail outside Bain's Mercantile. The door had a bell that rang with a tired jingle when he pushed in. Heat met him mixed with the smell of molasses and lamp oil. Glass jars lined the back wall. Buttons and needles kept in square tins. Rope coiled in a barrel like sleeping snakes. Across the counter, Baines looked up over his spectacles, chin bristled and blue with cold. "You have been a stranger, Mr. Holt." Elias tipped his hat. "Morning. What can I get you?" Elias looked at the shelves. His eyes found what they had come for without telling his mouth. He set his list on the counter with 1 finger. Apples. The red ones. 2 pairs of boots for girls that run. A bundle of wool socks. Needles. Spools of thread. Green if you have it. Baines moved slow but sure, the way a man moves in winter to keep heat where it belongs. He weighed apples on a scale, the brass tray shining in the lamplight. He held up 2 pairs of boots to judge size by eye, then turned them and pressed the soles. "You buying for?" Baines paused and only moved a shoulder. "These will do for 8-year-olds, 9 if their feet are narrow." Elias nodded. He tested the leather with his thumb. The stitching looked tight. He did not say who they were for. He let the silence hold what it wanted. Baines set the thread on the counter. He had red, black, white, and a single spool of green that had lost its paper label. He turned the spool in his fingers. Not many ask for green this time of year. Hard to see it in dim light. Elias touched the green with 2 fingers. That one. Baines wrapped the boots and socks in brown paper tied with twine. He put the apples into a canvas sack until it was full by feel. He watched Elias without staring. The room made small sounds. The stove at the back clicked as the metal adjusted to heat. A fly woke and hit the window once and went quiet again. "You been riding the North Line, Mr. Holt?" Wire sings when the wind comes in from the ridge. Heard it myself by the church. Elias paid out coins and brushed one back into the pile when it tried to escape. He nodded once. Hums most where the run is straight. Baines slid the packages forward. He held the green thread back with his hand for a beat, then let it go. You take care. The trail by Willow runs slick where the spring crosses. I had a woman slip there last week bringing in mending. Nora Lane, tough as rawhide, pride like a mare that never learned rope. Elias put the thread in his coat pocket. He could feel the small cylinder there, light as a twig. He turned his eyes to a rack of tin cups and then back. The name sat between them on the counter without being lifted. He did not pick it up. Thank you. The church sat across the street, white paint, dull with frost steps edged clean where a shovel had cut through. Reverend Harper worked near the top in a steady rhythm. He had a good hat, the kind that held shape. His breath rose in little puffs that the morning took and folded away. Reverend, Mr. Holt, I had been wondering if my eyes had forgot you. Come help me pretend this is light work. Elias took the shovel when it was offered. The wood handle had a smooth spot where hands had taught it what to be. He set the blade and pushed. The snow came up in a clean curl. The sound of it leaving the step pleased some part of him that still liked order. You take in service this week, Elias. I have stock to mind. We all do. They worked 2 steps in silence. Boots thumped on cleared wood behind them as 2 women went in heads close. Pine boughs lay along the rail where someone had set them earlier. Pitch bled sweet in the cold. Reverend Harper leaned on the shovel. You hear about Mrs. Lane out by Willow? She does needlework for half the town. Keeps to herself. I believe her husband died in Cheyenne working the rail. No boys to help her, and 2 girls with eyes like blue bottle glass. Elias lifted another curl of snow and laid it neat in the drift. He did not look up. Work is work. Amen to that. Some work leaves a man warm. Some work only wears him out. One should know the difference. Elias set the shovel back against the steps when they were clean to the door. He tapped his glove against his thigh to clear the snow and picked up the packages again. Thank you, Reverend. You are welcome, Elias. The bell will be right on time if I have to pull the rope myself. Elias crossed back to the mercantile and took his horse from the rail. The mare had iced hair along her withers and shook once so the frost fell like sugar. He tucked the packages into a saddlebag and laid the apples in so the skins would not bruise. He tied the mouth of the sack with the twine Baines had given him and pulled it snug. The knot looked like the one on the jar without meaning to. He rode the narrow street past the blacksmith. Oates stepped out, wiping his hands, lifted his chin when he saw Elias. The forge inside glowed a red mouth, breathing slow. Oates spoke around the rag in his fist. You come for that gate hinge next week. I have it near. Elias nodded. He kept moving. The road out of town sloped to the north and then bent toward the willows at the creek. Teams had cut a pair of ruts that looked harmless and were not. The ice there lay thin in places and thick in others. He kept to the edge and let the horse choose the safest ground. The world went quiet once he passed the last fence. The creek put a skin of glass over itself and whispered under that skin. Willows stood with their fingers bare. He could see where a small foot had slipped near the crossing and scuffed the frozen mud. He looked at it and then at the sky. Clouds high, a deeper gray tucked inside the light one. He let the horse drink from a pool where the water kept moving. The mare nosed and blew and made a neat hole, drank and raised her head with a drip from the chin. Elias put a hand under the jaw and a wipe it and felt the warm life against his palm. He waited until the breathing slowed and then moved on. The trail to Willow Cabin left the main road where a cottonwood had split and made 2 trunks from one root. A ribbon of someone's laundry had blown there and frozen into a curl that rattled. He could see the line of smoke from a low chimney beyond the next rise. He eased the mare into a walk and let the leather stop creaking before he reached the top. At the crest he looked down. The cabin sat square to the wind, small and kept. A broom leaned by the door. 2 buckets hung under the eaves. The window curtain on the left had a tear that someone had pinned rather than sewn. He did not go closer yet. He watched for what the place would tell him without asking. In the bare willows along the yard, there was a touch of color. A few tin spoons had been hung on a string, and they turned and clicked small and careful. The sound carried clean in the cold. 4 notes came together and then apart. Elias slid off and took the parcels out. He checked the knots on the apples and tucked the green thread into his vest pocket. He stood with the horse until the mare let her weight go soft on one hip. The lantern on his saddle blinked once when a gust found it and then steadied. He turned toward the narrow path that led to the door. He did not speak. He had what he had brought and the hands to set it down. The rest would be the work of shoulders and breath, and the cold air that made everything make sense. He stepped off the trail, where the drift had been kept shallow, by a board set for that purpose long ago, and the snow made a small sound under his boot like a word he recognized. The yard smelled of smoke and wet ash where yesterday's fire had gone soft. Elias walked to the stoop and set the packages on the top step. The paper made a dry noise. The apples shifted inside the canvas and pressed around against the cloth. He straightened the boots so the toes matched and brushed a skim of rime from the leather with the back of his glove. From the willows, the spoon chime clicked. It was not much, only a handful of kitchen metal on a string, but the sound carried like a quiet kind of laughter. 4 notes touched and left. The horse blew once and settled her weight deeper into the snow as if she trusted this yard. The door had a thin line of frost along the floorboard, where the wind found its way in. Elias stepped to the porch edge and looked up at the gutter. A ridge of ice had built along the Lip-Toothian white. Melt from a weak sun had started it, and night had finished the job. He could see where water would back up and come inside. It was the sort of thing that hurt wood if no one bothered to notice. He put a boot on the rail and reached up to test the ice with his glove. Solid. He tried again with a little more weight and felt it give at the seam. He went back to the horse and pulled a small pry from the saddlebag. It was only a nail puller that lived there out of habit, the handle worn smooth by years. He climbed the 2 steps, put one knee on the rail, and set the blade where the ice met the metal. The first piece cracked like a plate. It fell and broke itself again on the step shard, skittering like glass. He worked slow so as not to bend the gutter. Cold bit the strip of skin above his glove where the coat sleeve had pulled back. He did not mind. The rhythm pleased him. Set, pry, crack, fall. He cleared a span as long as the porch and knocked the last tooth free with the heel of his hand. Behind the curtain on the left, something moved. It was small and quick and tried to be still. The fabric had a tear and a pin held the rip together, where a proper stitch would have made it right. Through the thin place he felt eyes. He kept his own on the gutter and brushed slush from the rail in neat sweeps that made the wood show clean. The spoon chime found another breeze and answered his work with a soft clink. A whisper rose in the room behind the glass, high and careful, the way children talk when they believe doors can listen. He will hear the spoon's June. He already did lark. A second voice, close and small. How dull you know? He is fixing the roof mouth. Elias put the pry back in his pocket and blew warmth into his hands. He left the cleared ice piled away from the steps where no one would slip on it. He shook out his gloves, then reached for the packages again. He took the boots from their paper and set them by the door heels, together toes angled toward the hinge, so a child would know which shoe matched which foot. He tied the sack of apples to the porch post, where a gust would not knock it over. He tucked the green thread in the corner of the step safe from moisture. He did not stack them to be seen. He placed them to be used. A floorboard inside creaked. It was the small kind of sound made by weight, carefully added. He turned his head enough to see the shape of a woman through the curtain. She stood still, wrapped in a shawl, one hand low, as if steadying her breath. He did not go to the door. He did not knock. He touched the brim of his hat without thinking, and stepped back to give the stoop its space. The horse lifted her head and pricked her ears. Elias looked to the yard and saw tracks near the cottonwood where the girls had played, 2 sets close together. He could read the way one had stepped wide, and then closer the way the other had dragged the toe and made a little trench. He did not name them in his mind. He let the lines say what they said without putting letters to them. He walked the edge of the porch and tried the downspout. It was blocked at the elbow. He eased the pry into the throat and felt the ice resist him. He twisted, and a plug slid free and thudded into the drift. Water rattled once, then laughed quick and gone. He stepped back and checked the pitch. The gutter would run now when the sun worked at it. Behind the curtain, the smaller voice came again. He smells like the barn. Not bad, like wood and smoke and leather. The other answered, maybe he is the kind that listens to wire. Hush. The door latch clicked. Elias kept his eyes away. He did not move. The door did not open. The latch only lifted and settled back. He heard a set of light feet run, and a lower voice remind them of winter and bare boards and not catching cold wearing only stockings. He could see the edge of a skirt. He could see a hand that caught a sleeve with the same grip as someone catching a thought. He stepped off the porch and took up the path to the yard. He went as far as the first willow and stopped. The spoon chime turned and touched itself again, 4 small notes that made the hair on his wrist rise. He looked at the spoons and the string and the knot. The knot had been tied tight and then wet, had swelled the fiber. It would hold. The spoons flashed dull light and looked like little moons when they turned. He spoke then. It was not a greeting. It was not even a word a person would own. It was only what his mouth did when his thoughts had to come up into air. All right, He took 2 steps to the side where the drift had covered the bottom of the fence. He brushed snow from a brace and saw where the board had split near a nail. He pulled the nail and set it back a finger's width to catch good wood. The hammer in his saddlebag answered his hand as if it had been waiting. The strike made a sound that bounced off the cabin wall and came back clean. Snow began to fall from a sky that did not look like it had anything left to give. The flakes were thin and few. He felt them melt where they found heat. He finished the brace and set the hammer away. His breath smoked and faded. He went to the porch again, not to be seen, only to look once at what he had set down. The boots, the apples, the thread that would close the curtain and keep the room warmer than it had been. He set his hand on the rail and felt the wood under the freezing skin and the way the house held itself against the cold. He did not look through the curtain. He did not search for a face. A girl's hand appeared in the tear of the fabric and picked at the pin. Another hand covered it, careful and steady. The curtain stilled. He could have stood there another hour. The cold would have taken his fingers if he let it. He knew how to stand and how to freeze, and how to leave the world to what it was. He went to the horse and gathered the reins. The mare turned her head to him, as if to ask if they were done. He stroked the jaw once and felt the warm, damp hair where breath had settled. He put his foot in the stirrup and paused, his hand going to the pocket inside his coat. The paper waited where he had put it, a small flat shape that held more weight than it should. He pressed it through the cloth. It felt like a heartbeat that did not belong to him. He swung up and sat for a moment, saddle leather cold through his coat. He took one last look at the stoop. The boots were right where a child would reach them. The apples hung safe. The thread had not slipped. The spoon chime turned in a light breeze and made its 4 sounds. The chime had a good voice for something made of spare parts. On the way out of the yard, he put the mare at a walk. He guided her around the ice at the spring and leaned forward to clear the cottonwood that had grown 2 trunks from one root. The ribbon that had frozen there rattled again. He did not take it down. It belonged to the day. He reached the road and let the horse choose her line. The town sat behind him with its smoke lines and straight streets. The ranch lay ahead with its long sheds and dark windbreaks. He kept himself between those places, the horse under him, a steady thing, the cold air a clean thing, the yard. He had left a small fire in a wide field of white. The stove at Blue Hollow held its heat like an old friend. Elias fed it a split of aspen and set a black pot on the grate. He trimmed fat from elk shoulder with a small knife that knew his hand salted it and worked the pieces in the bottom of the pot until they browned and gave a smell that tightened the chest. He tipped in onions and let them go, clear added dry chilies ground with a pinch of cocoa, then beans he had soaked, then water from the kettle. Steam rose and found the rafters. He stood quiet while the first boil rolled, then dropped the heat and listened to the slow tick and hush of a stew choosing itself. He put 4 spoons on a folded cloth and set them near the door. An idea as simple as setting a nail straight. 3 would be used. 1 might be for silence. He did not name it out loud. He wiped the handles with a clean rag and stacked 2 bowls and then 2 more. He lifted the lid and tested a piece of meat, pressed it against the side of the pot, and felt it give. He added salt with 2 fingers, tasted the broth, and stood still until his mouth told him he had it right. The light had gone thin by the time he packed the pot into a padded sling for the saddle. He wrapped the bowls and spoons in a towel and tied the bundle under the skirt of the seat so it would not rattle. Outside, the air had gone hard again. Snow found the hollows with the same patience he had used on the gutter. He swung up and set the mare to an easy trot, lantern riding at his knee. The light marked a small circle around him, and the horse breathed in a slow, even way that said she trusted the return. The willows at the creek made a dark lace against the sky. He crossed where the ice looked new and thin, the mare finding the stones. The spoon chime sounded before he saw the cabin. 4 small notes turned in the cold. The sound met the lantern light, and both of them felt right. He stopped at the stoop and took the pot in both hands. Steam wove out through the blanket, where the weight of the lid made a line. He knocked not hard once. The door moved and then held. Nora opened it a hand and watched him with eyes that shifted from his face to the pot and back. Her mouth made a small shape that was not yet a word. "I brought supper," he said. "It is a good night for heat." She let the door open wider. The warmth inside was not much, but it had a smell of bread crust and pine smoke. The girls stood a step behind her, 1 on each side, hair loose from braids that had carried through the day. June looked straight at the pot as if she could see inside. Lark looked at the floorboards and then up at his hands. "You should not have," Nora said. He nodded once. "I did." He stepped in and set the pot on the table. The iron left a dark ring on the wood that would sand out with time if anyone cared. He unwrapped the bowls set 3 at the table, then went back to the porch and reached for a 4th chair that had been left there to whiten. It was rough oak scarred at one rung. He brought it in and placed it opposite the smallest plate. No one remarked on it. The stove snapped as a knot let go inside the fire. Nora kept her shawl around her shoulders but loosened it at the throat. The room showed its plainness without shame. A sewing basket sat under the window, thread ends tucked into a pincushion. The tear in the curtain had been pinned more carefully than earlier, as if someone wanted the gap to behave until it could be made right. Elias ladled stew into bowls and handed the first to Nora. When she hesitated, he tipped the ladle so the meat settled, and the chili did not splash her fingers. He filled bowls for the girls and gave himself the last. June blew on the surface and tasted and closed her eyes for a breath. It is hot, but good hot. Lark held her spoon with both hands. It tastes like it took a long time. Elias ate 2 bites and then lifted a piece from his bowl with the side of the spoon. He leaned and placed the tenderest cut into Lark's stew. It sank and then rose by the edge of her spoon. She looked at it, then at him, then made a small nod as if not to lose her edge by saying thank you too fast. Nora ate without a sound at first. Her hands were steady, a little red where the cold had found them. After a few bites, her eyes flicked to his hands as he held the ladle. The way he set it down and wiped the edge with a cloth between bowls said he had lived with breakable things. She set her spoon by the side of her bowl and looked at the steam instead of at him. "You came from the ridge," she said. "Yes. Wind from there pulls in along the wire," she said. "It hums like a thought you cannot catch." He nodded. "The wire sings deepest where the run is straight." June looked between them, as if listening to another talk under the words. Lark scraped her spoon and found the piece he had given her. She chewed slow and watched his hands again. "Bread would help," Nora said, and then caught herself. She stood and went to a shelf and brought down a small loaf and cut it with a careful knife, thin pieces that still gave smell. She set the bread on a plate and placed it near his bowl without ceremony. They ate the rest in a quiet that felt friendly, not stiff. The girls told him where the rabbits ran after a snow, that the tracks started neat, then hopped wild near the tangle, that once they saw a fox, and it looked over its shoulder as if ashamed of being seen. Elias listened the way a man listens to weather, nodding, where sound answered sound. When the bowls were empty, he rose and took his to the basin, and rinsed it with warm water she had left on the stove. The girls flew to help June, dragging a small stool over the boards to reach. The stool legs squealed. Lark held a towel and made great ceremony of drying 1 spoon at a time. Elias let them own the task. He handed each piece by weight and waited until a little hand took it from his. Nora stood near the door with her arms folded, the shawl slipping on one shoulder. She watched him wash the ladle, watched him tip the pot and run water around the burned place and pour it out the back step where it would freeze a shallow glaze. She had the look of someone measuring a thing that might fall if set wrong. He set the pot on a trivet and turned to her. "You did not have to bring 4 spoons, she said. He looked at the table. "No." "Then why?" He set the towel down. It felt wrong to leave the chair empty. She closed her eyes once and opened them. A shine crossed at the rim and did not fall. She moved the shawl back into place. The room breathed in and out. The stove settled and gave a pop. June brought the stool back to the wall and put it where it always lived. Lark pushed the last spoon straight on the cloth with a finger. The spoon chime outside clicked a soft answer, 4 notes that came close to the rhythm of their breath. "It is a fine thing," he said the chime. Lark put a hand on the sill as if to catch the sound. "We made it from the drawer with the crooked handles. We were not supposed to take the good spoons." June made a face. "They were not the good ones." Nora's mouth softened. "They are good now." Elias reached for his coat. He did not linger. The work he had brought had been done. The rest belonged to the house. He bent to pull his glove on, and the green thread on the window shelf caught his eye. It had been set there out of the damp. He did not look directly. He kept the notice to himself. He stepped to the door and opened it far enough to let the cold come through and make the warm feel stronger. The yard lay quiet. The lantern light pooled on the stoop and showed the shape of small boots tracked in and out. He went down 1 step. A touch caught him at the waist light, and certain. June had slid in behind him and wrapped both arms around his coat. "You smell like Christmas," she said into the wool. "Smoke and orange and something like a tree. Not a tree in a room, the kind outside." Lark stood near and held his sleeve and did not look up. Nora did not call them back. She stood with her hand on the door and watched the way the coat wrinkled under their hands. Elias did not turn. He set his hand over June's for the space of 1 breath and then eased free. He looked once at Nora, as if to make sure the door would close well enough to keep heat. She met his eyes not long exactly enough. "Thank you," she said. He tipped his hat. Then he went down the last step, set the pot sling on his arm, and crossed the yard. The spoon chime moved once and fell quiet. The horse shifted her weight and blew white air. He put the pot where it belonged on the saddle and tightened the blanket. The cold had sharpened and made the stars visible above the low roof. He mounted and turned toward the path that would carry him back through the willows. The lantern made a small circle again, just enough to see the next touch of ground. The door of the cabin closed behind him with a sound that did not feel like an ending. Sunday put a shine on Ash Ridge that the sun could not. The bell at the church sent 4 notes over the frozen street. They hung in the air as if the cold had caught them. Children went in with clean faces and red ears. Men stamped their boots on the steps and took off hats and put them back on out of habit. Pine garlands draped the rail and bled a sweet, sharp smell. Inside, the women of the Ladies' Aid moved like a flock. Hands straightened ribbons. Hands pushed hymnals into neat stacks. Voices dropped when footsteps came near, and rose again when those footsteps passed. On the third pew from the front, 2 sat shoulder to shoulder, with their heads close the way women talk when they have decided a thing together. "She has him bringing meat and apples," said the one with a tight mouth. "Apples leave a scent on fingers," said the other. "Men like to think that smell means home." Behind them, a girl practiced a carol. Her small voice rose and fell, and made the rafters sound warmer than the stove could. The pastor's wife lit candles in small brass cups and smiled at everyone without hearing a word said. Nora Lane came in with her girls and took a place near the aisle. June's hair had been combed until it shone. Lark's ribbon had been tied with care, though the bow sat slightly off to one side. Nora had scrubbed their boots clean. Her own shawl had a new mend at the hem, where the thread made a small green line. She kept her eyes on the hymn number board and did not look at any mouth that moved without singing. A woman with flour on her sleeve stood by the back pew, arms folded, watching. She spoke as someone passed, and the words found the place they wanted to land. "Some of us never thought to tie a jar to a fence and reel in a ranch like a trout." Nora heard it. She touched June's shoulder and guided her forward. The girls knelt by a wreath and picked pine cones for their pockets. When the hymn started, Nora sang along clear and soft and did not let the note wobble. After the service, she crossed the street to Jasper's stitchery. The bell on that door sounded higher, a shopkeeper's bell, quick and eager. Jasper stood behind the counter with his hands flat on a ledger. His mustache had been waxed and stood like small brushes under his nose. He glanced at the window as if it might pull him away from this talk. "Morning, Mrs. Lane." "Morning." He looked at the ledger. "We are quiet this week. The ladies say they have their Christmas linen set early. I can only pay for 2 afternoons, perhaps 3 next week." Nora stood straight. Her hands were folded inside the shawl. She nodded once and did not let her mouth show what she felt. "I understand." "You do fine work," Jasper said, eyes still on numbers. "Customers have their ways. They like what they like. I do my best to keep them happy." Nora reached to the counter and slid a small tin toward her with the thread she had wound for him. The work had been neat, a small piece of order she could make. She placed it there and moved back. "If you have mending after the holiday, send word." He nodded and made a sound that might have been yes. He kept his eyes somewhere close to his hands and nowhere near hers. When she turned to go, he cleared his throat. "Be careful on the creek path. It is slick where the spring runs under. I would not want anyone to fall." She stepped out and pulled the door shut. The cold met her with a clean bite. June and Lark walked beside her, each carrying one corner of a small paper parcel. They had been given 2 broken ginger cookies by a girl at the back of the church who had not asked permission from her mother. The cookies looked like stars with a point missing. The girls held them like treasure and did not eat yet. They passed the bakery window. Heat rolled out when the door opened and laid a hand on the sidewalk. A woman came out with a peel over her shoulder cheeks, pink hair pinned well. She looked at Nora and at the girls and smiled with a mouth that did not reach her eyes. "If a jar and a bit of string are all it takes, I wish I had thought of it before my waist turned honest." Lark flinched without meaning to. June looked at the sky. Nora kept her steps even and her jaw loose. She did not turn and she did not speak. She put her hand out and June slid under her arm as naturally as breath. Across the square, the blacksmith yard threw heat. Elias stood there with his hat on and his gloves off, palm flat on the anvil where the iron felt warm. Oates wiped his hands on a rag and held up a hinge, thick and square, pinned straight and true. "You ask for stout, I make stout," Oates said. That gate will keep a bull in if the boards do their part. Elias took the hinge and turned it in his hands. The metal was smooth as a river stone where Oates had worked it. The forge glowed behind them, coals breathing and sending up a faint taste of iron. Outside the yard, men leaned in toward one another. Laughter rolled and broke in the street. "You hear," said one voice with too much cheer. "The widow out by Willow has herself a provider. Smelled like chili from here to the church." Another answered with a chuckle. "He always did keep to himself. Now he keeps to himself in a different house." Oates looked up with his eyebrows drawn tight. He put the hinge down and leaned his hip against the bench. "You know how talk gets when the snow sits, Elias. People pick up stories the way chickens pick grit." Elias watched the street steady, as if he could quiet it by refusing to move. His bare hands curled until the leather of his gloves creaked. He set the hinge back on the bench and reached for his gloves, one finger at a time. "Mouths have to be kept busy," he said. Oates wiped the bench as if that would help. "You come by after the thaw and I will set that gate with you. 2 hands makes it quick." Elias nodded once. He slid the hinge into his coat and paid with coins that clicked on the wood. He did not look toward the bakery. He did not look toward the church. He took his mare from the rail and walked her into the street. As he passed 2 women at the pump, stopped then kept talking in voices that carried on purpose. That night, Blue Hollow had the kind of quiet that makes a man notice his own footsteps. Elias hung his coat on a peg and set the hinge on the table. He lit the tall lamp and trimmed the wick until it stood clean. He took a piece of cedar from a stack by the woodbox, a length with a smell that put the forest in the room, and set it on the table. He brought out his small knife, the one with the horn handle that held sharpened secrets, and put the cedar against his palm. He carved a feather by taking away everything that was not one. The blade pulled long and sure. Shavings curled and fell like paper birds. The cedar bled scent. A midrib appeared where there had been nothing. Barbs suggested themselves under the knife, and then became real. He worked the quill until it set into a point that could be tied. When he had the shape right, he sanded it with a scrap of cloth, until the light could run along the grain without tripping. He cut a small square of linen from the edge of an old handkerchief and stitched an N in the corner with the same green thread he had bought that morning. The letter was small and set with care. He found a piece of red calico in a drawer of odds and tore it into a strip. He braided that strip with twine until he had a cord strong enough to hold. He wrote a note on paper cut from the margin of an old ledger. Ink pooled at the first word, then settled. "You gave me wind. I flew too near the fire." He folded the note small and tucked it behind the feather and the linen inside a tiny window frame he built from cedar scraps and a pair of bent nails. The frame made a square hole like the cabin window, a little piece of opening a person could carry. He tied the feather so it would hang and move, but not tear free. He held the thing up and watched it turn in the lamplight. He banked the stove and pulled on his coat. The cold came in when he opened the door, like a thing that had been waiting on the stoop. The mare tossed her head and looked at him, as if she knew this ride. He saddled without noise, set the lantern at the ring, and rode out to the north line. Snow deepened in the hollows. The wire sang where the wind touched it. He let the mare pick her way between the drifts. The night held him, and the field, and the sound of the creek under its skin. He stopped where the jar had hung, and it still swung there, dark glass against dark wire, a small shape that had learned to live with weather. He slid down and stood at the fence post. He lifted the frame and the feather and looped the red cord over the top wire. He tightened the knot and made sure it sat where a gust would not take it. He laid his glove against the feather, and it moved the way a wing moves when the air catches it. He touched the glass jar once with his bare fingers and felt the cold come in fast. He stepped back. The lantern painted a little color on the cedar and left the rest to the night. The wire hummed and then went quiet. He did not speak. He let the field take the noise of his breath and flatten it. He held one picture in his mind of a hand at a curtain and a small palm over that hand to keep it from reaching. He put the picture away where a man keeps what he cannot afford to carry in the open. He mounted and turned the mare toward the ranch. Snow made new lines over the old ones. The fence fell behind. The feather and the jar hung there where the wind could find them. The night closed around all of it, and the breath of the horse sent pale clouds into the dark, until the dark swallowed them. Night sat close to the cabin, the kind that presses its hands against the windows and listens. Nora trimmed the oil lamp until the flame stood small and steady. The girls slept on the narrow cot by the stove, a heap of quilts and soft breath, and the shape of 2 heads turned toward each other. June had thrown one arm over Lark and left it there like a promise. Their hair smelled faintly of soap and smoke. Nora took the chair by the table. The wood had a shallow groove where a forearm had worn it smooth. She set a single sheet of paper on the board and weighed one corner with the empty ink bottle. The room sounded like small things making up their minds. The stove ticked. The spoon chime outside touched itself once and then forgot to keep going. The lamp drew a thin thread of soot up the chimney. She opened the drawer and lifted out the pen. The nib caught light. Her hands were red from the day. She rested the pen over the paper and waited for the words to climb up from the place they lived. When they came, they were plain. Elias, please do not come again. She stopped and looked at the two lines as if someone else had written them. The letters looked tight, a hand holding on. She set the pen down and flexed her fingers. The skin cracked a little at a knuckle and gave a sting that felt honest. She lifted her eyes to the window. The curtain hung neat and pinned at the tear. She had meant to sew it days ago. The pin had done what it could. Wind still found the split and tested it. She stood and took the green spool from the shelf. The end had frayed back on itself and made a curl. She threaded a needle by the lamp and knotted the tail with a habit that had come from years and not days. She pulled the curtain down and laid the torn edge over her lap. Her stitches ran small, and even a line of green that looked like a path on a pale road. The cloth warmed under her hand and gave a faint smell of sun that had been folded and kept. When she hung it back, the window held its shape and the room felt less thin. She sat again and turned the paper. She tipped the ink bottle and coaxed one more drop into the well she had made. The pen scratched. Not because I am ungrateful, because this house has learned its size. Because I must teach the girls to live where we fit. Because kindness can be loud in a small room. She stopped and looked at the girls. June made a low sound in her sleep. Lark turned her face into the pillow and breathed in a way that matched June's. The match made Nora swallow. The spoon chime outside found a whisper of air and let go 4 soft clicks. The number felt neat and whole. She lifted the pen and set it down without touching the page. Her eyes went to her shawl on its peg. At the hem, a new mend held green thread set firm through worn wool. She rubbed the place with her thumb and felt the ridge of the work. She tried to hear the town and could. The bright voices that were careful when they were near and careless when they were not. The bakery door. The tilt to a smile that did not reach the eyes. The way a name could be said without sound and still cut. She looked at the letter again. The lines waited. She read them once. The first sentence stood. The second flinched under it. She rose and crossed to the stove. The cast iron glowed low in the belly. She opened the lid and watched the orange breathe. Heat touched her face and made her eyes water a little. She folded the paper along its own line and made it smaller. Her fingers left clean marks in the dust on the edge of the lid. She held the letter over the flame until the corner browned and curled, then took it away. The black lace of burn ran along the margin in ink that did not need a pen. She gave the paper back to the fire and watched it take slow at first, then sure. The lamp made a small crown on the table. The girls slept. The spoon chime spoke once, twice, then twice more. 4. Nora lifted the lid on the stove with the poker and let the flames have air. The letter gave up its shapes and fell into itself. She waited until the last line became ash threaded with red. She took the ash pan and opened the back door with her elbow. The cold looked her in the face. She tipped the pan and sent the gray out into the air. Some of it fell and some of it turned and went away. The night accepted it. She left the door cracked a finger. The room changed tone. The lamp began to burn cleaner. The air made the flame stand and hold. She closed the door and listened to the latch seat itself. She set the ash pan back and brushed her hands on her skirt. The smell of cedar touched her from somewhere she could not name, and then left her. She went to the window and put her hand on the new seam. The thread was tight. The cloth had learned to meet itself and stay there. Through the glass the yard lay in a plain hush. The willows stood without leaves and took the cold the way a tree takes what it has to. The spoon chime swung just enough to make a faint shine, where the bowl of a spoon caught lamplight. Nora pulled the quilt higher on the girls. June turned onto her back and put her hand on Lark's chest. Lark's breath lifted the hand and set it down again. Nora watched that movement 3 times and then 4. She sat the chair easing under her and let her own breath find the same count. On the table the ink had made a black bloom where the bottle had rested. She wiped it with a cloth until it looked like a shadow and not a stain. She put the pen back in the drawer point wrapped in a scrap of linen. She folded the shawl and hung it with the men turned toward the room. She snuffed the lamp with a smallco and let the dark return the walls to what they were. The stove glowed in its seam, and the seam lit the iron. The chime outside went quiet. Nora lay down on the pallet near the girls and turned her face toward the window. The thread that held the tear was green as grass under the moon. She closed her eyes and put her palm flat against the floorboard. The wood gave back its slow, steady warmth. She slept without words. Morning came pale and honest. Frost drew fern shapes on the window glass, and the seam of green thread held firm where Nora had set it. The stove kept a small red heart in its belly. June and Lark woke with the same breath eyes opening within a heartbeat of each other, as if the night had agreed to let them rise together. Boots, Nora said. Scarves, too. Lark slid from the cot and found her stockings by touch. June stood at the basin and splashed her face, sharp little gasps where the water bit. Nora set their coats on the chairbacks and shook out the scarves so the wool would not itch at the first wrap. She picked up her own shawl and felt the place where the green men ran along the hem. She turned it so the stitch faced the room. They ate a heel of bread and a slice of cold apple. June wanted to talk and did not. Lark watched her mother's hands. Nora braided June's hair and tucked the tail into the collar. She tied Lark's ribbon, even though the bows never sat straight. She pulled on the gray scarf she had worn every winter and felt the thin places where years had rubbed it smooth. We are walking, she said. Where June asked, Nora met her eyes, up to Blue Hollow. The girls did not make a sound like surprise. June stood taller by a half-inch as if air had lifted her. Lark's fingers found the seam of her mitten and smoothed it. They stepped out into the light. Snow lay to the ankle where the wind had slid it thin deeper where it had drifted. The spoon chime along the yard turned once and shook 4 small notes into the cold. The sound sent a quick line down the back of Nora's neck. She shut the door and checked the latch. She set her palm on the wood until it felt warm to her hand. Then she took the girls by their hands and set their steps on the path. The world spoke in small ways. Leather creaked. Breath made little clouds that broke and fell. The creek wore a thin lid and whispered under it. A crow moved along a fence line like a man walking a bench, cawing to hear its voice come back. Nora placed her feet where the land suggested. She did not try to match the old sleigh ruts. She walked a line of her own, a clean curve that joined one rise to the next. June and Lark kept time with her, one on each side, their arms swinging in a rhythm that matched the swing of her skirt. At the half-mile mark, June's steps grew longer, then shorter, as if her body could not decide if it was small or big. Nora squeezed her hand, and June looked up and smiled. Lark aimed her boots toward patches of light, where the snow looked shallow and was not. Twice she sank, and came up grinning, as if the surprise had been a gift. The sky sat low. The pines on the ridge made a dark line and held the wind off just enough. Nora looked straight ahead. She did not turn for the town or listen for its voices. The only sound she took was the clean cut of snow under their feet and the soft tick of frost falling from branch to ground. Now and then her lips moved without sound. The words were plain and short, not for anyone else, not afraid, not ashamed, not broken. Blue Hollow came into view the way a place should, a shape in the snow where a man had pushed back the world and asked it to make room. Sheds sat long and low against the hill. The barn roof held a line of snow that had not slid. Smoke rose from a small chimney and did not lean. The yard held a scatter of prints from cattle and a tidy scoop from a shovel along the path. A horse stood tied to a post with her back to the wind and her eyes half closed. Something like peace rode the air thin but there. Nora stopped at the outer gate. The rails had been mended. The hinge looked new. She could smell iron where hammer heat had worked it. She turned to the girls. "Wait for me here." June nodded and set her boot against the lowest rail. Lark put both hands on the top board and let her mittened fingers hang over as if they were little flags. Nora crossed the yard and found Elias at the east fence, his shoulders rounded as he set a board. He swung the hammer with quiet control and drove the nail true. He saw her when he set the hammer down. He did not reach for his hat. He did not call out. He looked at her, the way a man looks at a storm that might break or pass. Nora took the gray scarf from her neck. A patch near the end showed new thread in a small ladder of stitches. She held the scarf between her hands as if it might need steadying. She stood close enough to speak without raising her voice. "I am not asking you to fix us," she said. Her voice did not shake. "Just stay long enough to see us bloom." He looked at her for a time that felt like a whole leaf falling. His breath made a white line and unmated. He ran his palm down the face of the board he had just set, as if the wood could tell him what to say. "I do not know any ceremony," he said. Nora moved the scarf closer. "Put this on when you are outside. It is colder here than by the creek." He took the scarf. His hands were cracked where work had split the skin clean where he kept them scrubbed. He ran the wool through his fingers once, and then set it around his neck and crossed the ends in a way that would hold if he cut fence all day. It changed his face by a shade the way a new collar can make a man look like he belongs to another hour. "Thank you," he said. Behind them, the girls could not hold still. June came first, feet quick, arms out, then slowed within arm's reach as if a rule had tapped her shoulder. She looked up and then put both arms around his waist without asking. Lark came next and took his sleeve in both hands and put her face against the coat to smell who he was. Her breath fogged the wool in a small oval. Nora watched and did not speak. She had not placed the picture in her mind this way, but it fit. Elias stood with his hands at his sides a long half-second, then put one hand over June's, where it circled him, and set the other on Lark's head, palm open so she could leave when she wanted. The set of his shoulders shifted. It was not relief and not surrender. It was something like a gate that had been shut on a chain and was now unhooked. He looked past them to Nora and met her eyes. He did not hold the look. He did not hide from it. He turned toward the gate and unlatched it with a quiet turn, the kind of movement a person learns with time. He held the gate with his body so the wind would not slam it. "Come in," he said. They crossed under the gateboard, the girls walking side by side with their shoulders touching, as if the world could not wedge itself between them. The mare by the post lifted her head and blew once approving or curious or both. The yard smelled of hay and iron and the clean cold that follows work. A row of tools stood on pegs in a straight line, each with a shadow marked on the board so it would know where to go. Elias led them along the path. He reached up and touched the lantern that hung under the porch, and it woke to a steady flame. Light made a small circle on the snow and turned the frost on the step to sugar. He stepped aside so the girls could go first. June put her boot on the first step, and then the next, with a ceremony that had nothing to do with words. Lark followed us with a small sound that might have been a laugh. On the porch, Nora stopped to take in the shape of the door. It had been planed smooth, and the handle shone where hands had learned it. She could see another peg by the frame where a man might hang a second coat. She could see a broom bristle out from under a bench and a small bundle of cut kindling stacked with the splits all pointed the same way. Elias set his palm on the jamb as if to feel the house think under his skin. He looked at Nora again. She lifted her chin a fraction and then let it fall. He opened the door and the room gave heat in a soft wave. It met them on the threshold and held. June stepped in and stopped just inside as if there were a rule for that. Lark rubbed her boots on the mat and made a game of getting every bit of snow off before she crossed the seam where floor met rug. Nora came last. She touched the nick in the door frame with one finger and then put that finger to her side. Her shawl slipped and she pulled it back up. The gray scarf on his neck sat like it had always been there. Elias stood with the door in his hand for a heartbeat and then let it close. The latch found its seat with a sound that answered something in his chest. He turned and the room met him with what it had. A table clean from use, a stove banked but ready, a chair pulled a little off square where someone had risen in a hurry and not bothered to put it right. He did not touch any of it until the girls had their hands where they wanted them. Outside the light shifted and snow let go from a branch and fell soft and deep, and a small puff lifted and broke apart. The lantern under the porch burned without moving. The scarf at his throat kept his neck warm. The breath in the room evened. The door knew how to keep the cold out and did its job. The room had that soft kind of heat that comes from a stove kept honest. Elias set his gloves on the table and shook snow from his hat over the mat. June walked to the edge of the rug as if it were a stream to be crossed. Lark stood by the window and fogged a small circle with her breath and drew a heart in it with a mitten tip. Nora kept to the doorway for a moment and let her eyes learn the space. The boards were swept. The chair near the stove had a patch of shine where a hand rested between chores. A shelf held a row of cups, set lip to lip like quiet neighbors. Elias cleared his throat. "I have an idea." He stepped back into the cold and crossed to the barn. The door slid on a rail with a wooden sigh. Inside smelled of hay and leather and the good iron that lives near animals. He ran a palm along a beam and felt the season in the grain. Against the wall lay short lengths of old fence cured by years of wind. He pulled 3, then another 2. He found a ladder rung that had worked loose and kept its strength and a narrow plank from a broken crate. He shaved splinters with his knife until the edges would not bite small hands. He carried the pieces to the yard and fixed them together on the ground slats, crossing slats a tree of boards that came to a point because he told them to. When the frame stood, it leaned a little. He wedged a horseshoe at the base and slid a thick old book under one foot until the frame held without complaint. Inside, Nora had set water on and sliced 2 apples thin. She dusted them with sugar and a pinch of cinnamon and put them to simmer in a small pan until the air grew sweet. Cornmeal sat in a bowl, ready for the skillet. She moved in a way that left no noise behind her. The girls knelt at the corner of the table with a box of odds that held buttons, bits of ribbon, and velvet scraps, cut from a dress that had gone to rags. June sorted the buttons by color, and then by size, and then by which ones shone in low light. Lark wrapped yarn around a wooden spool and cut small tassels with careful snips. Elias shouldered the frame through the door. The corners of the slats threatened the jamb, so he turned it and brought it in sideways, boots, quiet on the floor. He set the thing in the corner near the window where the light collected. It leaned left until the horseshoe in the book argued it into place. He stepped back with his hands on his hips and let the room decide what it thought. Lark stared at it with an open mouth. "Is that our tree?" He nodded once. "It will do." June put a hand on the lowest slat. The wood felt cool and alive. "It is bigger than I thought wood could be without leaves." Nora handed a cup of hot water to each girl to wrap their fingers around. She touched the frame and looked at the pins where the joints met. "Good work," she said. Her voice had that low approval you hear when a seam lies flat. They set about making it theirs. June strung buttons on string and looped them along the slats so the colors ran like a river with stones in it. Lark tied ribbons into bows that did not match and put them high where they looked like small birds about to fly. Elias found a little tin bell in a drawer and tied it to a slat with green thread. He tested it with his finger. It made a quiet, proper sound. He lifted a clean spoon from the shelf, drilled a hole through the handle with a hand bit, and hung it where drafts would find it. The spoon gave a silver click that felt like a laugh caught in the throat. Nora cut a circle from a piece of yellowed muslin and drew a star on it with charcoal and stitched along the lines with a running seam. The thread she chose was the same green she had used at the window. She stuffed the little circle with wool and tied it near the middle, a sun with careful stitches for rays. She opened a small tin and found a feather Elias had carved long ago and forgotten. She ran her finger along its spine and set it low where Lark could see it without climbing. The cider simmered in a pot with a twist of dried orange peel and a nail of clove. The smell spread like a blanket. Elias brought out a narrow box wrapped in old paper and string from the cabinet near the door. He set it on the table and untied the knot with his thumb. Inside lay a carved star oak, worn smooth by a generation of hands. The edges had been eased long ago by someone who understood friction and time. He took the star in both palms, then looked to Nora. "May I?" he said. "You may," she answered. The sound carried the weight of a house saying yes. He turned the star and checked that the loop still held. There was a length of red cord in the drawer, the same one he had braided the night before, and cut short. He tied the star with the red and stood on the stool. The frame held under his boots. He reached up and set the star where the crossed slats decided to meet. For a breath, he let his hand rest there, the wood under his palm familiar and new at the same time. June stepped back until her shoulders met the stove. Her eyes shone. "Now it looks like a tree." Lark leaned to the side to see the top better. "Does it have to be that high?" "It does," Elias said. "Some things belong at the top." Nora brought the cider and poured it into cups, one for each. She set the corn cake on the table with the apples spooned over and the syrup running to the edges. The girls reached for cups with both hands and held them under their noses as if the smell could feed them. They drank and made little sounds that admitted pleasure. Elias lit 2 short candles and set them in iron clips he had made for implements. He fixed one low and one in the middle of the frame and stood near while the flames learned their place. Light moved along the buttons and knew each color by name. The spoon clicked once, twice, then twice again as air moved. 4 notes. The sound settled into the room and stayed there without trying. Nora set her hand on the back of the chair and watched the girls fasten the last of their ornaments. There was no ornament that matched another, a coin with a hole punched in it, a square of calico shaped into a bird, a strip of burlap tied like a bow, the little tin bell near the middle that filled the space with a soft assurance. The tree did not shine like a store window. It gathered what had been set aside and lifted it. They ate. The corn cake broke with a good crumb. The apples were sweet and darker where the sugar had met the pan. June told a story about white rabbits that turned brown when summer came back and lost their hiding place and learned a new one in the grass. Lark corrected where the rabbits had jumped. Elias listened, nodding hands around his cup. Nora's face loosened as she listened to her daughters try to outdo each other with truths that were almost stories. After the plates were cleared, Elias stepped into the small room off the main one and returned with a fiddle case. He did not open it. He rested his hand on the worn leather and then set it back on the shelf. Not tonight. He took down a small wooden box instead. He opened it and found a handful of tacks and 4 candle clips. He checked their springs and set them aside for another day. He cleaned the soot from under his nails at the sink and wiped his hands on a towel that had been washed to a thin white. Lark stood by the tree and watched the star sway, almost not at all. Is it always ours now? He looked at her. It is here because you are here. June reached for the spoon and set it moving with a touch. The sound answered the question in its own way. Nora came up behind them and put her arms around both girls. The 3 of them stood as one piece. Elias watched that shape as a man might regard a field that has chosen to grow again. He went to the shelf and brought down 4 hooks he had cut from antler and set them by the door. He screwed one into the jamb where a small coat would hang. He fitted the second under it at a height for a shorter arm. The third he set on the other side of the door. The 4th he held in his hand and looked at the wall and then at Nora. Here, he said. She nodded. There. He set the hook and the wood took the screw without splitting. June hung her scarf on the new hook as if she had rehearsed. Lark copied her and missed by an inch and laughed at herself and tried again. The candles nodded and did not drip. The room carried a warmth that did not ask for explanation. Outside, the wind touched the porch lantern and found its wick steady. The frame rose in the corner against the window, a shape made from work and scrap, and a star with red at its throat. The spoon clicked 4 times in a row and stopped. The sound left a clean edge in the air. Nora looked at the tree and then at Elias. She lifted her cup in a small salute that needed no words. He returned the gesture. The house held the moment the way good hands hold a bowl. Morning opened clear and cold, a fine crust over the snow that held a boot print for a heartbeat before giving it back. The frame tree stood steady in the corner, star quiet at the top, spoon clicking now and then when the stove pulled air. The house smelled of corn cake gone to crumbs and cider steeped low. Elias set a cup on the table and laid out the hinge Oates had forged. The cupboard by the sink had sagged its door, rubbing the frame until it complained each time Nora reached for a pan. He took the door off its tired pin and set it on his knee. The screws came slow at first, then easy. He wiped the edge with a rag and planed a hair of wood where swell had made it stubborn. The new hinge sat square pin clean leaf flush. His screwdriver turned 3 good bites and one that caught on grain, and then seated with a small sound that pleased him. He lifted the door and set it back. The swing came true. The latch found the strike without asking. Nora watched from the stove while she warmed a skillet. She had tied her hair back with a strip of calico, the tie sitting almost straight until a stray piece chose its own path. June stood by the window in her stocking feet and counted bird tracks across the yard, whispering numbers as if they were a secret. Lark sat on the floor with a rag doll and set it on each rung of the chair, in turn a game that made sense to her hands. Elias checked the cupboard twice to be sure the fix would hold through damp and dry. He closed it with 2 fingers and let it settle. He wiped his hands and crossed to the treadle machine that lived under the window. The belt had dried and the wheel had started to grumble. He found a tin of oil under the sink and tipped 1 drop into each point that knew to ask. The wheel spun under his finger and the sound smoothed. Nora brought a square of muslin and fed it through while he worked the treadle with a slow foot. The needle drew a line that lay straight as if it had been thinking of it all along. That is better, she said. He nodded. Machines like to be told they still matter. She set the muslin aside and wiped the plate near the needle with her thumb. Her hand paused over the green spool and moved on. Outside the yard threw sun back from every angle. The mare shifted and sent a small cloud from her nose. Elias stepped to the doorway and looked out. Ropes of seed potato hung in net bags from a peg by the rafters, eyes still asleep, skins dry. Onion sets waited in paper sacks stacked by the wall. He checked them without thinking, a habit that belonged to the part of him that measured seasons by the small things a kitchen keeps. On the shelf above the stove, a frame leaned face down. He took it down and turned it in his hands. The wood had been rubbed smooth by someone who touched it when they passed. Inside, a woman sat in a chair under a cottonwood, a baby in her lap, both caught forever in a shade that was no longer there. Meredith wore her hair pinned plain. The baby's mouth opened in a shape that suggested a sound the lens could not keep. The picture had a border that had once been white, and now lived somewhere between smoke and paper. He held it for a time, and then opened the small cabinet where he kept odd bits that were not tools. A ribbon lay there, and a nail too bent to be worth saving. He slid the photograph into the drawer and eased it on top of a folded handkerchief. He did not close the drawer all at once. He let the wood meet wood with its own small patience. From another shelf, he took a newer frame. The tin inside had been made by the man who set up his black cloth on the edge of that town last autumn. The picture showed the barn in its best light. Nora stood angled toward the windskirt, caught enough to show its weight, eyes not quite smiling and yet warm. June leaned on her hip. Lark held Elias by the elbow and looked up at him with a mouth caught between talking and laughing. Elias had not smiled for the camera. His eyes had softened just enough to say he had meant to. He set this frame on the mantel and stepped back. It fit there without having to be asked. June came to his side. "Is that us?" "It is," he said. She reached toward the tin and stopped herself before she touched glass. Lark came and stood on her toes to see better. Nora wiped her hands and faced the mantel. She did not look at the drawer he had closed. She looked at the new picture like a person looks at a window that has been washed. Elias cleared his throat. "I can put a hook for it if the shelf is not stout." "It will hold," Nora said. She glanced at him with a soft edge he had not earned and did not argue with. They ate what the skillet had given, thin cakes with the last of the apples warmed on top. The girls tried to talk with their mouths closed and failed, and tried again and grinned. Elias drank his coffee black and let the heat fill in places that the room could not reach. After they cleared the plates, June fetched the small stool and set it by the tree. She adjusted a ribbon that had slipped and set the spoon moving with the gentlest finger. The spoon answered the morning with 4 clean notes that hung and settled. Lark found the tin bell and tapped it until Nora's eyes told her enough. Elias went to the door with a small awl and 2 nails and set a square of leather on the jamb where the latch had begun to mark the wood. He pressed the leather home and drove the nails until they caught the stud behind and held. He stood with his palm on the door for a quiet moment. The wood gave a low sound as if it had exhaled. Nora came beside him and rested her shoulder against the frame. "They do not need to call you anything," she said. He turned his head a fraction. "I hear it whether they say it or not." Nora let that settle. She looked toward the mantel and then to the window. "There is tea if you want it later." "I will take it," he said. He checked the firebox and added a single split. He straightened the chair that had been left a little off square and left it that way as if the room had a say. He put the oil tin back under the sink where it lived. The hinge on the cupboard held true when Nora opened the door for a plate she had forgotten to wash. She closed it and smiled with the corner of her mouth in a way that counted for more than most talk. Outside, a sheet of snow slid off the barn roof and landed soft. The mare shook her mane and made the bridle jingle. On the peg by the door, the gray scarf hung next to 2 smaller scarves that had found new hooks. The green thread at the window seam caught sun and looked darker for it. Lark went to the photo again and raised herself up by her hands to look at her own face. "That is me," she said, as if the room had doubted. "It is you," Nora said. June leaned her shoulder against Elias. Her hair smelled faintly of soap and smoke. She did not say a word. He set his hand on the back of her head with the slow care a person uses when he has learned the value of steady weight. The day held. The stove ticked. The spoon clicked 2 and 2. The picture on the shelf stood where it had been placed and stayed. The door kept the cold out. In the rafters, the bags of seeds swung the smallest bit when a current moved through, then went still again. Spring took its time in Ash Ridge and then arrived in a morning with soft light and a sky the color of a ripened egg. The last of the drifts retreated into the shade at the fence lines and under the eaves. Water moved and did not hide the sound it made. Blue Hollow breathed easier. You could hear it in the boards and in the way the screens took the breeze. Elias rose before the sun and walked to the rows he had turned when the ground released. Soil held print and scent, a dark ribbon between pale stubble. He checked the markers he had set with a string line. Potatoes went straight in a neat run. Onions sat in precious clusters. Beans had not yet shown, but the furrows lay ready like open palms. A meadowlark gave its song from the top of a post and let the notes sit in the air. From the porch came the clean sound of water in a basin and the metal ring of a pail set down without apology. Nora sat on the step with a shirt in her lap. The sun caught the small sheen on her needle as it moved. The seam she set had the green of new grass. You could follow the path of her work from hem to cuff and see where old thread had given up and been asked to rest. She tied off and bit the knot and smoothed the fabric with the flat of her hand. The shirt looked ready for another season. Inside the house, the frame tree still stood in the corner. It had gathered a film of dust and warm light instead of frost. The star at the top had kept its red tie. The spoon that hung on its near side clicked only when the stove drew or when a door opened with a bit of zeal. The girls had moved some of their decorations into a box and left others. A square of calico sat like a quiet bird on a low slat. A coin hung from a string and flashed when the sun found it. June and Lark rode the colts in the yard, where the ground could still take a hoof without complaint. Elias had trained the animals on winter days that smelled of hay and sweat and iron. The little horses moved as if they understood who sat them. June's colt had a white sock and carried his head high until a word brought it down. Lark's had a black mane that fell to one side and made her laugh when it tickled her knee. They steered wide around a bed of onions and circled back with faces pink from air and the victory of staying in the saddle. "Stay out of my beans," Nora called, but her voice held more fondness than warning. "We are nowhere near your beans," June answered, and then redirected at the last second because she was exactly near the beans. The colt obeyed her hand and missed the bed by a length of ribbon. Lark followed and bounced once and then settled. Elias leaned a shoulder into the fence and watched. He had a fence nail between his teeth and a hammer in his hand, and forgot both for a moment. The colts made a figure 8 and then a circle, as if the pattern had been a good idea that occurred at the same time to both girls. Their laughter carried across the yard and touched the creek and came back faint but true. He went inside and found the shirt on the chair back. He put it on and rolled the cuffs and stood at the mantel for a breath. The new photograph sat where they had placed it. Nora in light that came through from behind her and turned the edge of her hair bright. June with her chin tipped toward a thought. Lark with her hand on his sleeve like that was a place to put a word. The old frame in the drawer stayed where he had left it. He did not need the picture to remember. He did not open the drawer. He let that quiet sit in its box. He took the oil tin and touched the front door hinges with a drop. The leather square he had fixed at the latch had colored to the tone of the wood. The door closed with a new confidence. On the jamb hung 3 scarves in a soft procession, the gray at the top. The smaller ones below, striped and plain. Hooks cut from antler held them without complaint. The room had a different sound when the girls came through. It took on another beat. They put their heads into the kitchen and did not take off their boots until Nora lifted her eyebrows. Then they sat on the step and worked laces with fingers that had not lost their gloves, then with fingers that had. Mud flaked, socks showed. The room carried the scent of earth, as if it had been hoping for it. "We walk the colts like gentlemen," June said. Lark nodded. "Gentlemen who run sometimes?" Nora held out slices of bread with butter pressed in with the back of a spoon. The butter had a taste of smoke where the cool shelf borrowed air from the stove corner. The girls ate and spoke around their food, as if the two things did not believe in each other. Elias stood by the sink and cut a heel for himself and then set the knife straight. He watched them without being seen and felt the steady thing that happens when a room decides on its people. They went back out and Nora followed to the porch with her shirt finished. She shook it once. The fabric held its shape and did not flinch. She set it over the rail. The green seam caught a strip of sun and looked darker for it. She bent and swept a corner where winter had left grit. It made a small cloud that drifted and fell and disappeared into the larger clean. Elias checked the bags of seed in the rafters and ran a thumb over the eyes on the potatoes. They had swelled just enough to show they meant to work. He lifted one bag and decided on tomorrow for the far row, and something like gratitude came and sat down on his ribs. He brought the fiddle case to the table and set it down. He had cleaned the pegs and rubbed the bow. He did not play a tune to show the day anything. He drew the bow across one string and let the note live and go. It found the corners and touched the frame in the corner and made the spoon tremble. The spoon clicked in answer 4 times, neatly spaced. June came up to the porch and listened with her head tipped. Lark leaned against the rail and rested her chin on her forearm and made a sound like a cat would make if a cat knew about maple and resin. Again, June said. He drew the bow softer, and the string gave a voice that did not compete with birds. Nora looked up and held his eyes and then looked back at her seam, as if that were where the music had come from. He stopped and set the fiddle down and did not explain why. They ate early, potatoes and a skillet of eggs and the last jar of stewed tomatoes from the cellar. The table felt right with their hands set on it. After dishes, Elias took the picture from the mantel and wiped the glass with the edge of his shirt and set it back. Lark touched the corner to square it and then smiled at the wrongness of that. June went to the frame tree and lifted the coin so it would catch evening light. Nora wiped the stove lip where the kettle had stained it and gave him a look as if to say that nothing important had been left undone. He stepped onto the porch when the light tilted and felt the air pass through the open field and come cool to his skin. The willows along the creek wore a green that was only a rumor but would not be called a lie. Somewhere a calf bawled and found its answer. The house behind him had the sound of a room that has chosen its pitch and intends to keep it. He spoke without meaning to and did not speak loud. Every day I show up, and it holds. No one asked him to repeat it. The words belong to him the way a tool belongs to a hand. The spoon under the frame tree clicked in the softer wind. 1, 2, 3, 4. It let the last sound fade into the girls' laugh as they came through the yard in a chase that had rules they did not bother to share. Nora's needle flashed at the porch rail and then rested in the cloth. The gray scarf on the peg moved with the open door and then went still. The feather that hung by the entrance turned once and found its place. The day settled without ceremony. Shadows lay where they were told to. The door caught when it closed and kept what it was meant to keep. In the rafters, the bags of seed swayed a finger's width and stilled. On the wall, the newest picture took the last light and held it the way glass can then handed it back to the room. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.